Hey everyone, in today's episode of the SysAdmin DOJO Podcast, we've got Paul Schnackenburg back on the show, and today we are talking about this whole concept of cloud native, right? So what the heck does cloud native mean? So that's the big question that Paul and I are going to be answering on the show today. We're going to talk about what it is, who it's for, why you would want to be cloud native, and lots more coming up next on the SysAdmin DOJO Podcast. Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of the SysAdmin DOJO Podcast, the podcast designed to help you become the kick-ass system administrator within your organization. As always, I'm your host, Andy Serwich, and our guest today is, I guess, more of what I would call a regular co-host. We've had Paul on here several times, and he's back again today to talk, about cloud, M365, and everything in between. How's it going, Paul?
I'm pretty good, Andy. How are you?
Doing good. Well, it's good to have you back on the show, my friend. We always have great conversations. And, when I started putting together kind of the outline and taking a look at this particular episode, I had you in mind for this, just because I know you're in the trenches day in and day out doing work with M365, Azure AD, everything that kind of falls into this particular episode. And for those that aren't aware of what cloud native is, I guess that's where we're going to start. So we're focusing on this whole concept of cloud native architecture today, right? And the first thing that always comes up in this conversation, and I'm sure, Paul, you've run into this yourself, is like, what the heck does cloud native mean, right? And I have some thoughts on, kind of where I see it fitting, but we'll start with you, Paul. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I have had this question many times from different clients over the years and students, and absolutely, it is a good question. And to me, it really means cloud native, strictly speaking, cloud native means you do not have any on-premises IT infrastructure. Everything is in the cloud, either in the form of SaaS services like, Salesforce or Microsoft 365, or, you're using a public cloud like Azure or one of the other ones to run your workloads. So you don't have servers and that sort of infrastructure. Now, obviously, you never get away from all the infrastructure. You still have internet connections, you still have Wi-Fi networks, you still have wired networks. That doesn't go away, but that would be cloud native to me. But then again, you can talk about it from an application point of view. And people who are really focused on different types of applications will say, well, if it's running on Kubernetes in the cloud and it's microservices and it's taking advantage of all the cloud services, then that's a cloud native application. So you can certainly slice that a few different ways, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And I think when I came up with the show notes for this particular episode, what had prompted this entire idea for an episode, if I go back to my service provider days, I spent a year-ish doing technical account management type of work for a cloud solution provider. And the holy grail for any customer was to get them to a cloud native place. Now, you couldn't do that with every customer, right? So, you have, mid to large enterprises that's obviously going to have some sort of on-premises footprint. Definitely certain verticals are always going to remain on-prem if there's compliancy stuff in play, like medical, or strangely had quite a few manufacturers did work with that fall into the U.S. Department of Defense supply chain. So there's definitely all kinds of red tape around where workloads live and that type of thing. But that's kind of where my brain was when I kind of came up with the idea for this episode. And like you said, there's a couple different ways you can slice up the terminology, right? If I'm a developer and I'm making a cloud native app, right, it's in regards to the application itself and whether it's designed to leverage modern cloud technologies. Whereas I think the way that at least I hear it used most often, I think, is in the way that we're kind of talking about, and that's I don't have anything infrastructure-wise left on-prem anymore, right? And that's really, to me, what I think cloud native means.
Yep.
So
agreed.
I start looking at that, and again, putting my technical account management hat back on, start thinking about, like, historically all the things that have been a sticking point to getting to that magical cloud native place, right? And that's, the first bullet point that kind of comes up after what does cloud native mean is Active Directory, because like the core of any environment anywhere is your identity mechanism, right? And for the vast majority of organizations on the planet, that's Active Directory. And I mean, for years and years and years, we ran Active Directory on-prem and Windows Server, and obviously to get to, again, quote unquote cloud native, we need to replace that identity mechanism with something else, right? So in the Microsoft space, we have Azure AD. So what are your thoughts on kind of how Azure AD fits into this whole cloud native puzzle, Paul? And does it really get us to that cloud native place, I guess?
Yes, it does. So it sort of depends on where you start. So if you're a startup in the last couple of years, you're probably cloud native from day one, and you probably never worry about Active Directory. You're always going to be in Azure Active Directory from day one, and you're going to use that, right? And that certainly is a good place to be from an identity point of view. But many businesses, including small businesses, often they find themselves in a hybrid scenario, right? That they have Active Directory on premises, they have Azure Active Directory, and they often use Azure Active Directory Connect which is a free download from Microsoft, to connect the two, right? So you create new user accounts, you disable user accounts, you reset passwords, everything else happens on premises, and then it's synchronized to Azure AD. The problem today from a cloud native, I want to go cloud native, there really isn't a supported mechanism from Microsoft to say, hey, we have 1,000 users or 100 users or 100,000 users on premises, and we want to get rid of our Active Directory. We just want to migrate it all into Azure AD. There is no mechanism today to do that. Now, if you've got 100 users, you could obviously do it manually, right? Like you could sit down with a list of 100 users and just recreate the accounts in a Azure AD, right? Or create the accounts in a new Azure AD and just turn off your Active Directory at the end, right? Everybody gets a new password. But there is no other mechanism for that today, really, which is, I mean, the first time I had that question was like 7 years ago. Well, what do we do with Active Directory? How do we get rid of it? Well, today there is no way to do that. Like there is no supported way. I mean, I don't know whether there's a third-party tool maybe that will do it for you, but you proceed with caution, right? Because Active Directory isn't just here's 100 users. There's also groups and permissions and years of legacy settings, and we'll come to group policy in a second, right? All of those things, right? Like it's not just as easy as just turning it off. So I am still waiting for Microsoft to come out with a solution for that. Like here's the button where you actually turn off your Active Directory. And for a lot of large businesses, that's not something they want to do. Right? Like the Active Directory is the crown jewels. Like that is for medium to large businesses. That's where they keep all their security. They've been managing and maintaining that thing for 20 years, many cases. So they're not gonna. That's going to be the last workload to go, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I think back to one of my original IT jobs. I think it was the second or third IT job I had. This was back in like the Windows 2000, 2003-ish days. Like I had just started getting into AD and identity management and that type of thing. And I'm walking through the data center one day, and at the bottom of the rack, there's these two like super old ProLiant servers just sitting there. Like, I mean, you remember the old like beige coloring on their servers? Like, yeah. I mean, these things were old. I'm like, what the heck are those used for, you know? Oh, that's some old NT domain that we use for like two things now, and everybody's too afraid to touch them, so we just leave them alone. and that's, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's the reality, right? That's where so many organizations are, is their Active Directory force has been around for 20 years, and there's user accounts in there that, Bob, who was an IT admin 18 years ago, set this up, and it's been working ever since, and nobody knows how to get a hold of Bob anymore, and everyone's afraid to touch it and break it,
Yeah, totally. That's a big one, right? Absolutely, that's a big one. The other one I didn't mention when we're talking about Active Directory is also applications. Like if you have applications today that rely on Active Directory, right? They rely on Kerberos and LDAP locally. Again, you can't just turn that thing off. Now, ultimately, at least for SMBs, the aim, of course, is to get to just using cloud services.
Yep.
Okay, then you can at least get rid of that part of Active Directory. But the last step, it's not going to be that easy. Another one, just tying into hybrid here for a second, is Exchange. So for the longest time, many businesses around the world have migrated from on-premises to Office 365, Exchange Online, right? But if they did in a hybrid, not in a cutover way, they still have to maintain an Exchange server on premises.
Yep.
Because the only way to change email addresses and do everything else you need to do Exchange-wise is to do it on premises, because that's where the user accounts are housed, right? That's where you need to do it. So you needed that Exchange server. Now, interestingly, Microsoft came out with a blog post about 2 weeks ago as we're recording this, talking about how you can get rid of that last Exchange server. So they got a PowerShell setup that you run on workstation. That's what's going to manage the Exchange objects, and now you no longer need to maintain that last Exchange server. And that opens up another interesting point for getting to be more cloud native. So Azure AD Connect, so AAD Connect is an on-premises tool that you run on a server on premises. You can run it on two if you want to have standby failover. But there's a lot of like management overhead, and you've got to make sure that thing is working so that it's synchronizing all the changes from on-prem to the cloud. Now, there is a newer solution in classic Microsoft fashion, confusing nobody. It's called Azure Active Directory Connect Cloud Sync. And what this means, so I'm just going to call it Cloud Sync from now on. So when I'm talking about Cloud Sync, that's what it means, right?
Okay.
Cloud Sync is a service that runs in Azure. So you manage and maintain it from the cloud. And it does maybe 3/4 today of what AAD Connect does. And you just have a little agent on a couple of servers on premises, right? And that's a much easier setup, but you haven't been able to do it if you were in Exchange Hybrid, because it didn't support Exchange Hybrid.
Right.
But the new solution that has come along now from Exchange, and I have not had time to play with this, sounds like it might actually solve this problem. And then you could migrate to AAD Connect Cloud Sync, and that would make you more cloud native, but you're still stuck with Active Directory. And as I said, tying back to it, I have not seen a solution where you can turn off your Active Directory and say, hey, now the source of authority is Azure Active Directory for everything. And whether that's ever going to come, I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good point. Because, I mean, yeah, you've got Azure AD Connect, but I don't know, whenever I'm talking about AAD Connect, people are asking me like, hey, well, okay, yeah, I've got my on-premises accounts, and then how's Azure AD handling the authentication from the cloud side? I mean, the way I always explain it, it's like, it's almost, I know technically this is not like what it is, but it almost feels like a trust, right? Between two domains almost. It's kind of what it feels like. It feels like a trust sync between the two sides. And I mean, yeah, like you said, AD is always the frustrating bit. And I mean, I know you have services like Azure AD Join, but they're still relatively new and not entirely there yet, right? Maybe we'll get there at some points. In terms of migration, you mentioned earlier third party. I don't remember who it was, but I do remember there was a time where I had seen a quote for a migration of user accounts from on-prem to Azure AD using a third-party tool, and it was like the cost was astronomical. I mean, it was I like without giving any like scoping numbers or anything like that. I just remember like it was fall out of your chair expensive. So there are tools out there, but they are a premium, that's for sure. So obviously this is not an easy problem to solve, right?
No, it's not. It really isn't. But as I said, if you're a smaller business, because smaller businesses are much more agile, right? They don't have the same technical debt, right? Large businesses just like you invest in something that's new and shiny and modern today, and in a few years' time, it starts to become technical debt. And now you have this technical debt hanging after you. And when it comes to on-premises infrastructure, there's lots of reasons that technical debt hangs around for a long time.
It really does.
Right? 10, 20 years, right? Old applications written in-house, but everybody relies on it. We need to use it. So there's all sorts of reasons why large business cannot be as agile as small ones. Small ones can go, look, there's 5 of you using this application. You've been using it for 10 years, but this cloud service over here, it's easier to use. We're just going to switch. Sorry, you're just going to get a bit of training, and we're just going to switch, and we're going to get rid of this thing on-prem because it's just not worth it anymore. And then you just do it, right? But you can't do that when we're talking about 50,000 users. So,
right.
So it's more challenging. So and I mean, so if you look at my clients, I only have a small handful of clients, but they are, let's say, 2 of them still have Active Directory on premises, and they still have infrastructure on premises. One of them is entirely in the cloud, and no guesses for the fact that the one that's entirely in the cloud, well, almost entirely, we'll come to files in a minute, they're a much smaller organization. They're a much smaller organization. The other ones are in the hundreds of people. So it's just harder. But ultimately, when, and I would say when, because I'm assuming, like Microsoft is chipping away at this problem. The other thing they've done, which is quite interesting, is Azure Active Directory, and this is 6-month-old maybe. Azure Active Directory now supports in preview handing out Kerberos tickets. So at the moment, this is only really focused on your storage of your user profiles when you're doing Azure Virtual Desktop. But we can totally see in the future that if you have AAD handing out Kerberos tickets for things that you normally would rely on AD handing out Kerberos tickets for, you can totally see a future where that need goes away, right? And you can actually not rely, you don't have that for file access and SMB, that sort of file sharing access. You don't need it anymore because you get a Kerberos ticket from AAD.
Interesting. That is one of the missing pieces there.
But they're not there yet. Sorry.
I was going to say that's one of the missing pieces there is the Kerberos ticket, definitely.
Exactly.
Interesting.
So you can sort of see how Microsoft is like it's a big elephant. Now, this is a terrible analogy. It's a big something.
Right.
And they're chipping away at it at the edges, right? So don't eat elephants, but you know what I mean? Like they're doing it in piecemeal. And eventually one would hope that they would get to the point where they say, okay, here you go. If you fulfill these criteria, you can turn off Active Directory and swap over to Azure Active Directory.
Right. Definitely. Yeah. I guess the other way, to me, this would be kind of like a cheating way to do it, and it really isn't cloud native. I guess you could run DCs in VMs inside of an Azure VNet, but then you have to make sure you have VPN connectivity to that Azure VNet for anyone that has to utilize the services. And at that point, it almost sounds like more trouble than it's worth, right? But I guess you could do it that way. So
Well, some businesses do that. Some businesses do that when they have applications, right? Like we have this one application on-prem, relies on Active Directory. We don't want to run it on-prem anymore. Let's migrate it to the cloud, run it in IaaS. Well, it needs a domain controller, so you put a VM with a domain controller next to it. But that's still not like that's not really cloud native. That's like cloud adjacent.
Right, exactly. And it just kind of feels icky, right? It's like, hey, I'm taking this old on-prem technology and I'm putting into this nice shiny cloud service, and it just something about it, right? But anyway, so we spent a lot of time talking about the AD part of this. And, again, going back to that on-premises world, thinking about the tools and the infrastructure that we've used all these years, group policy is the next thing that always comes to mind, because it's kind of joined at the hip with Active Directory, right? So, I mean, in terms of, again, this cloud native discussion, what is the cloud equivalent of group policy, I'm a little ignorant on the workstation management side of the cloud. I've always been a storage and VM guy, right? But I mean, we've got endpoint config manager, I think, is and Intune. Well, they're kind of the same product, aren't they? Just different brandings.
Yeah.
Intune is the answer.
Exactly. Intune is the answer, right? So it's called Microsoft Endpoint Manager, or MEM, and in true Microsoft fashion, they've confused everybody. So MEM is the umbrella. Underneath that, you've got Microsoft Endpoint Manager Configuration Manager, which is what we used to call System Center Configuration Manager. So that's the edge computing part of that lives on-prem and then feeds up its information into Endpoint Manager in the cloud. And then Intune is the cloud engine. But if you're talking about, hey, we want to replace GPOs, and this is doable today, right? This is absolutely doable today. So there's really three things I want to mention here. First of all, if you have group policies on premises today that you're using and you're going, how can we get these to the cloud? We want to use Intune, right? We've taken the step from Office 365 to Microsoft 365. We got Intune in place. What do we do? So you can export your GPOs from on premises. You do a backup of them essentially. Then you import them into Intune, and it will give you a report for every single one that, hey, out of these 50 settings you got in this GPO, 40 of them will work as is in Intune, and here's the settings you need to go and set. 5 of them won't work at all, and 5 because they're not supported, and
Right.
5 of them you need to make these changes, right? So you get these nice reports to do the migration. So that's built in. There used to be a PowerShell script once upon a time you had to run, but this is all built into Intune now. You just run the thing in the Intune, import it, and it gives you a report. That's number one. Number two, when it comes to Office specifically, so Word, Excel, and PowerPoint on your local machine,
Right.
for those settings, which is what people often use GPOs for, you can use the config.office.com website, and we have an article on the Dojo talking exactly about this. And it is a really good solution for this because you can put in policies there to manage, you know, which versions of Word are available and all the different which languages are available, all that stuff, right, that you can do for Office. That can be managed from that solution, so that gets rid of that one. And then ultimately, I think the power that people have to realize is that group policies is Windows only. Right? It's Windows client and Windows server. Whereas what you get with Intune is, hey, a modern business clearly has other devices that are not Windows, right? They will have Mac OS, laptops and whatever, and they will have iOS and Android, phones and tablets, whether they're company owned or they're personal, right? So Intune opens up a whole new set of things you can do. Well, newer. So you can put configuration policies, compliance policies. You can control the data on those devices. You can control email so that even in small businesses, when somebody leaves the organization, they're not just walking out with their smartphone full of documents and emails about the business that has sensitive data inside of it, right? That can all be set up using Intune. So absolutely, Intune replaces GPO. Now, the last one, number 3 point. So to help on-premises administrators or administrators used to GPOs, you can now use a whole subset of the ADMX templates that are available in GPO and Active Directory in Intune. So if you go into Intune and you look in the portal where you're setting your configuration profiles, there's literally, here's my templates, and they are the same settings wherever they are the same, right? Like there's obviously a few that don't work, but for nearly everything else, that's there, and you just use those settings to control whatever you want on your endpoints.
Nice. Okay, so basically, it's like you said, it's designed to make it easier for your traditional on-premises group policy administrators to move over and start utilizing they'll feel at home in the new tool is what I'm saying, right?
Totally.
Gotcha. And, this particular thing, I bet you we could spend an entire episode on. I mean, I have questions, and, one of the things that comes to mind is how you've got your, your user settings, and then you got your machine settings, and then you've got different inheritance that you can set up with group policy objects, depending on, where at in the hierarchy the user is. Just quick question, does Intune allow that level of granularity, or are they still kind of trying to get to that point?
No, you don't have that granularity. There's not really a separation. Well, there's not really a separation between machine and computer settings in the same way. And that's sort of more reflective of the registry, because the
Right.
group policy in most cases are registry settings, right? And
Right.
you have a computer part of your registry, you have a user part of your registry. In the cloud, the way you apply policies in Intune is yes, as in the sense that you can create a policy that you apply to users, and you can create a policy that you apply to computers, right? So in that sense, you do them separately, but they're not sort of like in the user interface. You don't have computer policy and user policies in the same way that you have in group policy. That's a bit different. But other than that, you can absolutely say, hey, I'm going to set up a policy to control Windows 11 laptops, and I'm going to have these settings for them, and I'm going to apply them to this subset of these laptops or whatever.
Gotcha. So okay. So I mean, really, again, coming back to that main point is that people who have traditionally been managing group policy on premises, they will feel at home with the new tool, it sounds like. So
totally.
Very cool.
There's a bit of learning, but they will feel at home. And certainly with the last few things that I mentioned, the ADMX support and the fact that you can import your group policies to compare them, that's fairly new, like last year or something. So Microsoft is aware that they're trying to help the people.
Right, definitely. Okay. Very cool. All right. So again, checking things off the list of things that have traditionally held organizations back from getting to that magical cloud native place, right? We talked about Active Directory. We've talked about group policy. The other area where I see a lot of organizations stumble is on storage, right? They've got kind of like Active Directory. We've got these file shares that have been out here in some way, shape, or form for 20 years, right? And the permissions are a tangled, rat's nest, and only Judy from accounting knows where to get this one particular file that's 20 folders deep in the folder structure, right? I mean, this stuff happens, right? So, I mean, when we're talking about cloud native, storage was another big part of the puzzle for me. And I think, we've had our traditional on-premises file servers, but when I think about file storage options, I think about things like OneDrive for Business or SharePoint or Azure Files is the other big one that I think of on a regular basis. So I think those are kind of the three big ones. Am I missing any there that you're aware of?
No, the only one I would add to that list is Storage Migration Service. So this is a feature of Windows Server, just as a way to say, hey, we want to do that cloud adjacent thing we talked about before. So we have a file server on-prem. Maybe it's an old one, right? It's running, 2008 or something terrible, right? And you go, hey, we want to get off this thing. What do we do? Well, one option, if you still want to maintain an actual file server, is you can use Storage Migration Service in Server 2022, and I think it's Server 2019 as well. It actually allows you, as part of the wizard, to create an Azure VM. It is set up as a target for Storage Migration Service. It's going to migrate all your file shares from your on-premises to the new file server in the cloud. It's going to rename that file server in the cloud to the same name, so users will still have the same drive letters when they're connecting to it, provided they're VPNing into Azure, obviously. They have some sort of connectivity there. And it's going to do all that magically behind the scenes for you. And it is an online migration, so people are going to keep using your on-premises file shares until your terabytes of data or petabytes of data, whatever it is now in the cloud, and you're ready to fail over to that Windows file server in the cloud. That's one option, but as you said, it's a little bit icky because you're still stuck with a IaaS VM now that is your file server in the cloud. So tying back to your other options, and this is, I must say, this has been one of the sticking points for me with my small business clients as well, right? So one of the clients that I mentioned before, they're small, but they are an engineering firm. They produce a lot of CAD drawings, and they have a NAS on premises for files, right? It's just not easy for them to say, hey, we're going to put everything in the cloud. Particularly here in Australia, we've got terrible broadband. You're on the other side of a slow link. It's not the same as sitting 5 feet away from the server and connecting directly to it. But the options you mentioned there are important. So Azure Files is one that I think if you haven't heard of or looked at Azure Files, absolutely do this. You got file shares today on premises, even Linux Samba ones or NAS ones. You can put the Windows file sync, Azure File Sync agent onto it, and it will synchronize those file shares to an Azure Files share in the cloud.
Yep.
And what you get is you get bottomless storage. You stop having to buy new hard drives for your file servers, or new SSDs today, I suppose, because the data is seamlessly replicated if you choose tiering. So anything that hasn't been touched for 6 months, replicate to the cloud, right? Leaves a stub on the local machine, so you can still open the file if you need to, but it's all in the cloud. And then you can do backups of your file service in the cloud. And you can have multiple targets. So you could have the same file share being synchronized up to the cloud and then synchronized down to a branch office where you want to have that available on a local server as well. So Azure File Sync, very powerful. But it still sort of relies on you having file servers on premises.
Right.
Now, the truly cloud native cloud storage is OneDrive for Business, as you mentioned. However, I have seen many an on-premises admin go, OneDrive for Business is not good. It doesn't do what I wanted to do. Or you want it to be like a file share in the cloud. No, it's not that.
Right.
OneDrive for Business is your storage. It's like your home drive, right? Like it's Andy's home drive, and he's working away on a few files there, and maybe he and I are collaborating on a file, and he shares that one file with me. But it is not a place to put, several terabytes of data and then creating a marketing share and a sales share and an HR share and an engineering share. That's not what OneDrive for Business is, and it doesn't work like that. So that's where people often come stuck. There are third-party cloud storage options that are more like a file share in the cloud that you would have to look at.
Right. To kind of solve that issue, I have seen some people pivot to SharePoint and you utilize SharePoint for, document libraries and SharePoint to kind of fill that file server role. But again, that's very situational, right? That solution is not going to work for every organization. Kind of backing up to Azure Files, I personally really like that solution myself. I've seen it work well in a lot of situations. The one place where, again, if you're trying to get to cloud native, if you have latency sensitive applications, you're not going to get that real, like you said, you're not going to have that same performance as you would by having a NAS sitting, 5 feet away from you. It's just not the same. But I will say what I really like about Azure Files is that replication side of it, right? The way I've always explained it whenever I'm given a presentation on it is it's kind of like DFS, but it's actually good, right? So,
yeah, that's a good description. That's a good description.
Because I mean, don't get me wrong, DFS was okay, but how many times did you have to troubleshoot DFS sync issues all the time, right? All the time.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
absolutely.
I'm actually using
it's a simpler solution.
It is definitely.
It's a simple. It doesn't do quite everything that DFS used to do, but it is, for what it is. It's a great solution. So if you have file servers today that you're responsible for, you absolutely want to pop them in the cloud using Azure File Sync. It just makes life so much easier.
Yeah.
And you get free backup in the cloud. I mean, not free, but as in easy to set up backup in the cloud. So.
Right. Well, we talked about really 3 key points. Usually the things, like we've said a couple of times now, the main sticking points for getting from that on-premises world to that cloud native place. And I guess what it boils down to for a lot of people listening to this episode, right, is just the one question of hey, you've been talking about cloud native and you've been talking about getting to cloud native this whole episode. Is cloud native better? And the way I always look at this particular question is, again, I'm going to put my service provider hat back on, right? So if I'm a service provider, I have, 20 customers that I have to support. I don't have access to the data anymore. But at one point in time, I had data that showed the cloud native customers had fewer support incidences than the people that still had on-premises equipment, right? So I mean,
Absolutely.
from a reliability and a stability standpoint, cloud native is you can't compare it to on-premises in that regard.
No, you cannot. Absolutely. As soon as you get rid of your Exchange servers, your tickets go down by half. It's just how it works. And I supported SMBs for many years for Small Business Server. Fantastic solution for the time, right? But had Exchange built in, and there was always something, right? It was always something not working as it should, right? Getting out of that business and getting it all up into the cloud is a huge benefit. And as you say, the data is absolutely there. You have less issues. You just have less issues.
Yeah.
The one thing I would say, though, whenever anybody says, is it better? I'm a consultant, so I can always get away with this, right? Well, it depends, right?
It depends.
Because it depends on your scenario. You mentioned early on you have regulations. Like if you're a healthcare provider in the US, there might be, for instance, or even here in Australia, there might be reasons that you cannot put things in the cloud, right? Like a friend of mine, one of his clients, he runs his own business as well. One of his clients, they do insurance work, and they are just not allowed to put that data in the cloud. And he has a server on premises. And last time I think he told me he has 24 terabytes of storage, and it's not enough. Because every time they go out, they take hundreds and hundreds of pictures and videos of everything in a damaged house, whatever it is, right? And that all has to be stored, and it has to be stored for a number of years, and it cannot be stored in the cloud, right? And that's just how it is. He's just buying more hard drives.
That's painful. I've been in that.
It depends.
It depends. I was just going to say, I've been in his spot before. I've been in that spot before, but I'll let you finish what you're going to say first before I segue into that.
No, that's it. That was about it, I think. I was just going to say, like, it really depends on what your scenario is and where the cloud native is the better solution for you. But as a generic sort of broad brush stroke, at least for SMBs, and I think for medium businesses as well, yes, cloud native is better. It is more secure. We haven't talked a lot about security here today, but it's definitely more secure. And for most businesses, it is a better solution. But, and here's the but before I let you do your segue, you got to look at your internet connectivity. Because if you move everything to the cloud and you have one provider for your internet, even if you're an SMB, and somebody digs off the cable or some other problem happens, right, and you do not have a failover strategy, everybody's dead in the water.
Yep.
You got on-premises infrastructure, people can still work, right? So you do need to be aware that you need to do a risk analysis basically on where you're at once you've moved everything to cloud.
Definitely, yeah. The cloud is great until you can't get to it. That's what I always say. It's great until you can't get to it. With that in mind, like you said, you have to do that risk analysis, right? And so the customers that I always worked with in the past that got to that cloud native place, there was always a plan in place to either have an active passive failover internet connection, or if had a customer that really needed a lot of bandwidth, an active internet connection of some sort, right, that would fail over to a single side if it had to, right? So having that redundant internet connectivity from multiple providers is definitely the way to go for those that can afford it and need it, right? So exactly. But yeah, coming back to, you mentioned the your buddy with the on-premises storage, right? I've lived that before. So if I go again, boy, like 10, 15 years back now, 10 years, I don't remember. Anyway, so I was running a private cloud practice for, again, a service provider. And our big storage partner at the time was EMC. And I could not keep enough open disks on this particular EMC because this service provider I was at catered heavily towards the medical space. So lots of imaging, imaging files and things like that. And, we'd put half a rack of disks in, and 2 months go by and oh my God, it's full. We need another half rack, right? Yeah, EMC loved us, don't get me wrong, but it just, I could not get the hardware in and set up inside the data center to keep up with demand. And that's just is not a fun place to be, which is, one of the benefits of cloud native. Like you mentioned it earlier, the term bottomless storage, right? I mean, if you can live with the higher latency, if you don't have low latency requirements, you just need file storage. It's fantastic for that. So, very cool. Well, Paul, I think we're about wrapped up for today's episode. I want to thank you for stopping by and talking about this whole crazy cloud native idea with me. Well, not idea, it's a reality for some organizations, but it was a crazy podcast cloud native idea episode thing. I don't know. It's 10:20. I was going to say it's 10:20 p.m. On the eastern seaboard here. I keep saying seaboard in Michigan. Obviously, I'm starting to fall asleep, right? So I haven't had enough caffeine, so I'm losing my ability to talk. Anyway.
That's all right. That's all right. Look, I mean, we segued into a lot of important things. I think this is sort of part of the overall thing. We're at Hornet Security /Altara, we're helping IT professionals to adapt to the cloud and realize that it's not as scary as it sounds, and it's okay, and a lot of your skills do help you there. And I hope that what we talked about, I mean, we went off in a few sidetracks today,
we did.
What we talked about today hopefully will help administrators to see that there are options, and it is not. And it's not black and white. It's not like, oh, we have to be all in the cloud, right? Like that might be the end goal, but for a lot of businesses, they're going to be hybrid for a really, really long time. So, and that's okay.
Yep.
We have the technology to make that happen without it being too painful.
That's right. There is a path forward. I think so many people get stuck in the, oh my God, I'm losing my on-prem stuff that I've been used to the last 10 years. And that's a whole nother podcast episode by itself, right? Talking about that journey, right? So, but anyway, again, Paul, thanks for stopping by and sharing your knowledge with us. It's always great to have you. Those of you watching or listening, thanks for stopping by for this week's episode. Again, as always, you can go out to the Altaro Dojo, www.altaro.com/dojo for lots of great IT pro-centric content. We've got sections for Hyper-V, VMware, M365, backup and DR, VMware, all kinds of great content out there. Paul creates quite a bit of it for us. So, I know he mentioned a couple of articles as we talked through the episode today, so I'll be sure to include those in the show notes. So be sure to take a look at the URLs there. Other than that, thanks for stopping by. Hope to see you again 2 weeks from now for our next episode of the SysAdmin DOJO podcast. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you next time. Hey everyone, it's Andy again. Hey, thanks for watching the episode today. Hope you enjoyed it. One thing I wanted to leave you with, we've been talking a lot about Azure Stack HCI, Hyper-V, hybrid cloud, and a lot of the recent episodes. Wanted to let you know that on March 23rd, we are running a webinar that talks about all things Azure Stack HCI and hybrid cloud. Now, you can register for that webinar by clicking on the link in the description of this episode. And if you're watching or listening to this episode after March 23rd, you can use that same link to watch the webinar on demand. So hope you enjoy it. Again, we hope to see you for a future episode of the podcast. Have a great day.